Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Evolving Your Compliance Program with Skillsoft and StoneTurn. My name is Betsy Timbers. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Compliance Solutions here at Skillsoft. And I just want to run through a couple housekeeping items before we start the webinar. First, I want to let everyone know that today's session is being recorded. Following the webinar, we're going to send you a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides that we use. Second, if you have questions during the session, please enter them in the Q&A. We're going to be taking questions as we go throughout the webinar, so the more input we receive, the better. We'd love this to be an interactive discussion. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Tom Fox to kick off our webinar.
Thank you, Betsy. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'm extraordinarily pleased and thrilled to be with you today to help moderate this incredible webinar we're going to present with you. I'm extraordinarily pleased to have Stephen Martin, partner at StoneTurn, and Charlie Volker, Director of Legal Compliance Products at Skillsoft, to join me to talk about how the three of us see the complete integration of your compliance program as the Department of Justice has really laid out in the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. Before we get started, I wanted Stephen and Charlie, if you could introduce yourselves to our audience.
Hi, this is Martin. I don't know, I think we may have lost Tom a little bit here. It's great to be here on the Skillsoft presentation, and we look forward to talking to you a little bit today. My name is Stephen Martin. I'm a partner at StoneTurn. StoneTurn is an international boutique consulting firm that specializes in getting sounds like I'm getting some feedback too.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Charlie Volker. As Tom said, I'm the Director of Legal Compliance Products here at Skillsoft. In that role, I'm responsible for the creation and lifecycle management of our portfolio of online legal compliance training content. Unfortunately, I don't have any expertise whatsoever in audio over WebEx, so I can't help you, Stephen, with your issue, but I'm hoping we can get that resolved very quickly.
Charlie, thanks. Now I'd like to go through briefly the agenda for us. I'm going to talk about the 2020 update to the Department of Justice's evaluation of corporate compliance programs. From there, we're going to move into assessing your compliance programs, then risk assessments. Charlie's going to give us some thoughts on training and communication for your code of conduct. And that's going to really lead into a discussion of continuous monitoring and continuous improvement. One of the reasons I'm so excited about this webinar is in preparation for this webinar, visiting with Charlie and Stephen, it became clear that what the Department of Justice expects now is not simply that you as a compliance officer utilize data and data analytics compliance program, but that you engage in using all types of information. And what Charlie really enlightened me on and made me understand is that the information from your code of conduct, from your code of conduct preparation, from your code of conduct training, from the use of your code of conduct, loops back into allowing you to have continuous monitoring leading to continuous improvement. So I think it's going to be hopefully a real eye-opening presentation for you. I wanted to start off with what I see as three key themes from the 2020 update. Number one is the need for the compliance function to access and use data and information. The access portion is critical because the Department of Justice expects a compliance practitioner to have access to data. That means no siloed data. If data is siloed, you have to find a way to cut through those silos. The risk assessment. Previously, many risk assessments had been done on an annual or biennial basis. But now the department says you need to move them closer to real time. That means that if you have a new product, a new service offering, you're moving to a new geographic area, you need to perform a risk assessment. And really the third key concept is that of continuous monitoring and continuous improvement. It means getting information to the compliance program and the compliance practitioner through continuous monitoring from a variety of sources you might not have thought of as utilizing continuous monitoring. You may have thought of monitoring as transaction monitoring or due diligence monitoring, But I think Charlie's going to explain that information can come from your code of conduct. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into that. And Stephen's going to tie it together for the continuous improvement of the compliance program in real time. The next slide, where I took some of the specific questions from the 2020 update that the Department of Justice puts forward. If you'll recall, the evaluation of corporate compliance programs is a document to be utilized by prosecutors. So they'll ask a series of questions of a compliance practitioner, a CCO, or outside counsel about a company's compliance program. And around data and information, they pose the following questions. Are there data silos? If so, why do they exist? And what data and information has been used to improve a compliance program? Once again, you may think of data as data analytics, transaction data, due diligence data, but it's really information, and any information that you can use in to monitor your compliance program and indeed improve it is what the DOJ expects. Risk assessment. Is your risk assessment a one-time snapshot in time or based on continuous access to operational data across functions? And this really ties to the opening remarks I made about thinking about and moving your thinking and evolving your thinking of a risk assessment from a biennial to or annual event to something closer to real time. So is it a snapshot or is it based on continuous data? And then finally, continuous monitoring and continuous improvement. Does the company review and adapt its compliance programs based upon lessons from itself and others? For the lessons from itself, this could turn on your root cause analysis. But what about lessons from others? Do you keep up with enforcement actions in your industry? Do you keep up with enforcement actions in the geographic regions where you may be doing business? Do you keep up with enforcement actions from governments outside the United States? There's a wide variety of information that's available to you as a company going forward. So these, once again, came directly out of the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs 2020 update released on June 1. So we wanted to now turn to assessing your compliance program. So Stephen, hopefully you're back and you can take over on this slide.
It's amazing how we tested this technology before we all got on, and once you get on, it seems to go south. So I apologize to the audience for that. This is Stephen Martin, and Tom, thanks for sort of covering that while we try to get the technology working again. Nothing like, COVID and webinars and technology all combined together. My name is Stephen Martin. I'm with SumTotal. We are the advisory services partner to Skillsoft, meaning that we work with Skillsoft clients on a number of different types of projects, from risk assessment to compliance program evaluation, design, third-party program development, and serving as a global compliance advisor. By way of brief background, since you couldn't hear me in the introduction, I work with SumTotal, which is a boutique consulting firm that specializes in compliance investigations and monitorships, and I spend most of my time working proactively with companies to have really effective compliance programs that both meet the government expectations, but more important, really reduce, the risk in your enterprise, your organization, communicate to your employees what the expectations are, and help the organization, maximize profitability and success, and deal with all the compliance risks you might see. By way of background, I'm a former chief compliance officer for 3 major companies. And I started my career as a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, as well as Assistant Attorney General in Missouri. And so I try to really look at, what the government expectations are, but more important, as a, compliance officer, like many of you are on here, or in-house legal counsel, how are you practical and, real world in terms of what you deliver in the compliance program, and how can you really be a success inside the organization? And so when we talk about what government expectations are, there's all kinds of requirements out there: the DOJ guidance, SEC, the OECD guidelines for international, the UK Bribery Act. And most times, the senior management or board of directors are not particularly interested in hearing that. What they really want to know is, how is the compliance program working for us? And so what I've built is a 6-element compliance framework that takes kind of all the government expectations in around the world, whether it's the 6 UK Bribery Act components, or whether it's 9 or 13 from the OECD guidelines and the DOJ guidance, but really make it into a business-friendly way to evaluate and report on your compliance program. So these 6 elements, if your program can meet these 6 elements, you would have what would be deemed an effective compliance program from the government standpoint. And what we do, and what we're talking about a little bit today, is really how you assess your compliance program and what does that mean. It really all starts with the risk assessment. As Tom talked about with the new DOJ guidance that just came out on compliance programs, they're now focused more on ongoing risk assessment. It used to be that companies would do, like an enterprise-wide risk assessment every few years, or they might do in-country risk assessments every 3 years. Now it's really an ongoing and periodic review of how do you assess risk across the enterprise, in region, in country, and really looking at that. And then, how does the compliance program then respond to those identified risks? So if you don't identify the risk and risk map your organization effectively, then you can't really match up the compliance program to respond to those risks, and ultimately not just being in a responsive type of method, but really being more predictive in where things are happening and being more proactive in how you work with the business, so that you're not having issues or investigations or major problems. And then one of the, major things that is important is really around the training and education. And I know Charlie's going to talk about this a little bit, but, how do you have kind of practical training and communications to your organization on an ongoing basis that is going to be engaging and interesting to them, but also doesn't take too much impact onto the business. And, Skillsoft is excellent at doing that. And then, the other one that we focus a lot on that I see issues around corporations where they just aren't up to speed is on this oversight and reporting. How do you use data analytics? How do you use compliance information in an aggregated fashion to report that to senior management and to the board of directors, which helps them to show how you're doing with the compliance program, and then more important, helps you with resource issues and moving forward. And in there, we do things like ongoing monitoring, periodic testing, auditing, and issues that you tackle. I see analysis or looking at, what were the control weaknesses or other problems that had led to that, or alternatively, are you seeing the same problem in different parts of your company or different regions around the world, and how do you really respond and enhance the compliance program on an ongoing basis to respond to those kinds of situations. So, I think one of the things we want to do is we're going to show you kind of some sample deliverables today and how you can deliver this information to senior management, to the board of directors. But really, why do you assess your program, and what does that help you do in terms of creating kind of a 1 to 3 year plan for, the continued enhancement of the program so that it is. Tom, I'll turn it back over to you.
Stephen, with that, I was wondering if you could walk us through the next slide on assessing your compliance program and really show how the elements that you talked about tie into the various formulations of an effective compliance program, including U.S. sentencing guidelines, the UK Bribery Act, and the hallmarks of an effective compliance program.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that's important to be able to show, if you're talking to your board or senior management and you start talking about each of the requirements under the federal sentencing guidelines, as an example, if you periodically assess the risk of criminal conduct to take appropriate steps, they kind of gloss over, right? Your senior team doesn't want to hear that. They're not interested in, necessarily what the law says or the guidelines say or the act. They want to know, how are you operating and are you protecting us? And so what you want to do is really, as we talked about, just simplify it into these 6 elements. But what I've done here is created a chart that shows you whether it's the U.S. Sentencing Guidelines, the Bribery Act, or the DOJ's guidance. They each have different components. The UK Bribery Act has 6 different components to it. Others will have 9 or 13. You can do this with the OECD guidelines. You can do this with the Brazilian law. You can do it with agencies. The World Bank, as an example, has their own anti-corruption type of compliance program, and you can do it industry specific. But it all still comes back down to these 6 elements. And when you can simplify it and put it into really business-related deliverables, which we'll show you in a couple of minutes, you can very quickly provide, high-impact information that will both show the strengths of your program and the areas for opportunity or improvement. And then how do you get engagement from senior management and the board of directors, including resources to continue to build out and develop the compliance program, either internally or externally with assistance.
Stephen, as the Department of Justice has suggested that corporations move from a 1 year or 2 year risk assessment to something more of an ongoing basis, do you find that companies can pivot to, I don't want to say a smaller or a lesser risk assessment, but one more focused on perhaps a new product offering, perhaps a new service offering, perhaps something that is a little more focused on a more defined issue? Is that something that can be done within this context as well?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, Tom, because I think, a lot of folks that I talk to in corporations, they hear the word risk assessment and, it's almost like you don't know where to begin, or you think it has to be a huge, expensive project, time consuming and resource intensive, and that's not necessarily what you have to do. I mean, there are reasons why you would want to do enterprise-wide risk assessments, but on the whole, if you ask me when I talk to my clients, I'd say, you could do those every 3 years or so in terms of enterprise risk and across a number of compliance topics. But there are also multiple ways that you can do it, because you can do risk assessments in country or in region. You can do risk assessments by product. You can do risk assessments by location. You can do it by topic, like anti-corruption or data protection and privacy and cybersecurity. You can look at, from a risk standpoint, you can look at things like non-compliance program-related risk. Often we will see trade compliance that might be outside the compliance program, health and safety or environmental, and so you can work with those teams. So there are various ways that you can cut through kind of the risk assessment and do it on an ongoing basis. Another risk assessment would be around controls and testing or auditing and monitoring. And so, it doesn't have to be major projects every time in terms of what you do on, quote, assessing risk. It can be formal, it can be somewhat informal, and it can be in, what I would call more bite-sized methods in terms of you being able to do it on an ongoing basis. And I think that's really a challenge for companies, because they just, they often try to understand what's the scope and how do we do it, how do I get started, how do I document this, what are the number of interviews, how do you approach it? And, the nice part is, while the Department of Justice talks about, risk assessment, it doesn't define how you have to do that and what's going to be required.
Stephen, I've switched over to a new microphone, so perhaps the sound will be a little bit better. But along that last point, how do you incorporate information that may not have been traditionally seen as a part of a risk assessment? And I want to specifically point to things like information generated from policies and procedures, information generated from training, information generated from hotline reports that come in. How can a compliance practitioner begin to think through utilizing that information in this ongoing risk assessment that the DOJ wants us to consider now?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think a lot of compliance programs, there are some compliance programs out there that are very sophisticated, and certain industries like financial services have unbelievable amounts of data and information that they've collated. Most of the companies out there, don't do a great job of being able to understand and aggregate compliance data and be able to then use that both for reporting purposes, but more important, for really understanding how effective the compliance program is at the end of the day. And what you're clearly seeing in the market, in the compliance market, is this move towards data analytics and using that information. And so what companies need to do at the outset is really understand what are the kind of compliance information and flows that the company has, and how can you consolidate those, often using some kind of compliance software technology management tool. Skillsoft has one of their partners that does this, where they really have a compliance management software that helps you aggregate data, helps you deal with conflicts of interest, disclosures, training records, risk assessment, all the kind of information that you would want to gather. And that's really the most effective and efficient way to do it. Most companies can't really build it internally, but they can organize and kind of catalog the data feeds that they have, whether it's hotline reports and investigations, training records, auditing that they're doing, and then really how do you connect into other key organizations, parts of the organization that are going to be important, like HR and procurement and some of the other areas that you'll have to gather data and information to see how you're complying with things like trade sanctions and due diligence and screening of third parties. So what I see quite a bit is just disaggregated data and not really understanding what's out there and how you can pull that together, and then being able to use tools that are accessible to be able to organize that data in a more effective and efficient manner. And it's a big challenge, but it's also a big opportunity. I mean, if you look at a lot of companies, you go in and it's interesting, they sign all kinds of contracts with any number of, third parties, whether it's, suppliers or sales agents or others, and they don't even have contract databases. They don't even understand what's really in the, in the language of those agreements and what they're being required to do, let alone from, compliance and using data to see how both those third parties and people that are inside the corporation are actually acting in complying with, both law and the code of conduct and policies and procedures of the company.
On your next slide, you show a sample heat map, but I'd really like you to focus on the left-hand part of the risk types, because you've spoken quite a bit about legal and regulatory, but there are a lot of other risks that will be detailed in a risk assessment. So could you spend a few minutes talking about the importance of reputational risk, obviously financial risk, but even operational risk?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because, companies often have, and I'm sure, with the attendees that are on this list, if I ask the attendees, probably 80% or so would have some kind of enterprise risk management program or system. What's interesting about it is companies can often look at financial and operational risk. They're usually very good at understanding, what's happening in that part of the organization and how they handle it because it's been the focus. But they don't really have a very good understanding often of the legal/regulatory and compliance-related risk types. I apologize again to the audience. We tested all of this, and it seemed to be working fine right until we all went live. So I'm not sure what's happening. But when we talk about kind of reputational risk, I think this is one of the areas where I see companies not really being successful in looking at the impacts. While we can quantify what would be kind of legal penalties and fines and investigations, and certainly those are significant, companies are not as good about understanding the real reputational impacts and, the cost both from a financial perspective, but also just onto the organization, the employees, and things that come with, major compliance failures. And so, what we try to do is really work with companies on this kind of comprehensive, risk mapping across these, 4 areas. Again, financial and operational, are usually handled well by companies, but really focusing on this legal, regulatory, and then reputational types of potential risks that come in, and then, ranking them and getting, some understanding of how they're being addressed by the compliance program, but, what's the likelihood of impact, what's the likelihood of having a problem going forward, and, and how severe would it be at the end of the day, because then you can, plan around from a resource standpoint or from an enhancement standpoint or compliance program what the key areas and focus are going to be.
Stephen, in the era starting with Me Too, Black Lives Matters, economic dislocation, and of course COVID-19, we've seen reputational issues not simply come to the fore, but are really exponentially more important now. Can a company use a risk assessment to help literally protect itself from a change by measuring not only the shareholders, but other stakeholders, employees, third parties, the communities they reside and work in? Is that something that a company could use really on a proactive basis for the reputational issues many companies now face?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a perfect example of having the need to have ongoing risk assessment, right? Which is, COVID came out of the blue and nobody was expecting it. It was not on anybody's risk, matrix, or very few would have had pandemic on there. But how you handle those challenges and then everything getting locked down and all your employees working remotely, and how do you have transparency and how do you protect systems and information, and what's happening there when you can't see your employees and how do you adjust? That's an ongoing kind of a major risk that the companies have all faced and had to deal with, and would have been outside what would have been more predictable. And so, it's a perfect example of why you need to do that. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is something that Skillsoft is going to be launching to their audiences, is around this idea of interactive code of conduct training, and how you can really utilize your code and being able to do that in a more active fashion through ongoing training and communication to your employees, where you're having kind of constant contact and kind of more interaction than you would have had in the compliance program before, just because information and risk moves so fast today in this world, and you've got to be able to change things on an ongoing basis and be able to get that information out to your employee base as well as your third parties.
Charlie, I'm going to move over to you on the next slide, which is training and communications for your code of conduct. And I was wondering if you could not only walk us through this, but really explain why code of conduct training obviously is foundational for a corporation. But for me, the key insight that you brought to my attention was that your code of conduct training really informs not only your risk assessment, but your continuous monitoring going forward. And I was wondering if you could maybe start that conversation for us with this slide.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I'll be happy to do that. So I think, everybody here, we understand that code of conduct training, is the foundational experience for employees to understand the risks that the organization faces, as well as, the standards of conduct that are expected of them by the company. So, maybe we'll talk about some best practices for creating and deploying the code of conduct training program to achieve that. And then in particular, we'll talk about how it relates to the risk assessment, as Stephen was just talking about a moment ago. So as far as best practices, the first one, I think, is that the training has got to be flexible and configurable to be able to specifically address the concerns that are identified in the risk assessment. And ideally, you achieve that by bringing together a combination of a couple of things. One is instructional material to lay the groundwork about what those risks are all about, to help employees understand, what exactly the risks mean to them, as employees of the organization. And ideally, that is then coupled with excerpts from the company's actual code documents. And by doing that, you provide, the general understanding as well as the specifics of how the company goes about addressing those risks, and how the company expects its employees to embody those strategies as they go about their day-to-day work. Another consideration is ensuring applicability of the messaging within the Code of Conduct training program. And really, you can think about that from two different angles. The first is that this training has got to be delivered to every employee within the organization. And it's understandable that there may be some reluctance, to go to the time and trouble to provide code of conduct training to everybody when it may contain coverage of issues that, at least at first glance, don't necessarily apply to everyone. But I think it's worth considering that, information about what's going on within the organization can reach employees that you may not expect. And if you take, for instance, let's say FCPA concerns, it's tempting to think that an executive assistant, for instance, doesn't need training on that topic because, they're not in a position to pay a bribe to a foreign official based on what they do day to day. Fair enough. But maybe they will be aware of what a sales executive or, a third-party representative is doing. And that few minutes of FCPA training that they received as part of the Code of Conduct program may mean the difference between their making a report about what they become aware of or ignoring what ends up becoming a major problem for the organization. So again, there's tremendous importance on ensuring that the program is able to reach everybody within the organization. And the other angle I think worth considering is the accessibility of the training itself. Now, I can't resist a shameless plug for e-learning, obviously. Given the convenience for the learner, the ability on the administrative side to track and report on assignments and completions, and also, in the case of a global organization, it's really key to be able to deliver the training in the employee's preferred language. And so really this goes to the fundamental accessibility and relevance of the content for every employee. And that's important because what we know from an instructional perspective is that the more accessible and the more relevant the message, the more likely the recipient of that message is going to internalize it and be able to put it into practice. One thing also to consider about the role of the code of conduct training within the organization is that it really provides a springboard for additional training beyond the code itself. So you have the foundation, as we talked about, with the code of conduct, but then that allows you, in addition to that, to go beyond the code and to create additional training within the program that is perhaps more strategic. So it may be something that is based on job role, geographical location, other factors that play into whether employees are likely to encounter, the risks that the organization is facing. And so really the code of conduct provides a way that all of that subsequent communication and training can build on the fundamentals that have been covered there. So, we've been talking, so far about what I think is really sort of a less emphasized role of the training and communications component of the compliance program, and that is, as you said, Tom, the ability to utilize the data that comes out of training and communication in ways that Stephen described, as being important for feeding back into the risk assessment, and really important for allowing the organization to have a deeper understanding of what's actually going on, under the hood, so to speak. So, if we're talking about training and how that operates, you can think of, for example, the assessments that may be included within an e-learning course. And, the organization has the ability to analyze the results of those assessments. And those results can point to issues that may require follow-up. It may indicate that additional training on a particular aspect of a topic is warranted. Similarly, that there's fantastic technology out there that allows companies to provide surveys to their employees. And you may not initially think about surveys as having a role in a compliance program, but in fact it can be extraordinarily valuable to get the opinions of employees about the challenges that they're facing. They may not realize that what they're describing is actually a compliance issue, but when that information is funneled back and analyzed, it can become clear very quickly that, the challenges that you're hearing about from, let's say, sales representatives is actually, it draws back to a failure of a compliance function somewhere within the chain. So that can be really useful information, to send back through to the risk assessment. And particularly in the case, as Stephen was describing earlier, how, we know we need to move to a more continuous risk assessment as opposed to one that's happening, every so many years. Having that sort of continual flow of information that comes from the training and communication aspect of the program can really help to facilitate that real-time information making its way back to that overall risk assessment approach.
Charlie, on this slide, you've got Code of Conduct Foundational, and when you started your remarks, I thought you were going to talk about the code as foundational for your compliance program, but after listening to you, I've actually come to perhaps a little bit different focus, which is the Code of Conduct training is foundational, but it's foundational because of the information which can be generated back to the other components of your compliance program, obviously starting with a risk assessment, but you really focused on information and how information can be used to not only address an issue that may need addressing, but also as a monitoring. Would that be a fair assessment of where you took this?
I would say so, Tom. I think the more information that you can have at your disposal for analysis and for informing, where does the program need to improve? Where does the program need to go in order to respond to, as you were saying earlier, a new product line, a new service that's being offered, maybe, a new market that the company is entering into. The more information that we have about, what that means for employees and what they're doing day to day, the better informed the compliance program overall can be.
Stephen, if I could go back to you for our next slide, which is compliance programs, assessments, and roadmaps. I was wondering if you might be able to give us some thoughts on how the information generated by your risk assessment, or indeed the information that Charlie talked about from code of conduct, training, or communications can be used to help provide enhancements and opportunities, and then why a roadmap is so critical in your opinion.
Yeah, so, when you do a compliance program assessment, I mean, they're relatively, straightforward. They're not a huge resource constraint in terms of time or money, but they give you a very good snapshot of where your compliance program stands vis-a-vis the government expectations, industry requirements, as well as best practices. And, the two kind of sample deliverables we have here on the slide, and I think we're providing additional ones to the audience here, or people can feel free to reach out to me and I can give you a series of these. This is a way to report this information to the senior management or to the board of directors. And, while you can't see it in detail here, it ranks them by, tiers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. It talks about, when the suggested timing to undertake the reviews. Tier 1 would be real gaps in your program. We often call them key program opportunities. But, gaps in what you should be doing kind of immediately to address potential risk or problems or deficiencies in the compliance program. Tier 2 is really around those 6 elements that we talked about, and here you can see, where each one falls into which element, and, kind of the implementation efforts that are done. And then tier 3 is really kind of best practices and things you can do as you have the resources and time, but, on more of kind of often a 1 to 3 year plan. And then you go into, each of these recommendations and create an action plan of how you're going to enhance and improve your compliance program. And the nice part about being able to use kind of this reporting, as opposed to, kind of long legally written memos or other things, is, your board members and your business executives can very quickly see, like, okay, what are the enhancement opportunities? Where are the gaps? What's the timing? What's the program look like? Where are you headed on the enhancement? What kind of resources do you need? And it gets them much more engaged and a much higher level of buy-in, especially in terms of being able to get resources to move forward on the compliance program. And again, this assessment is pretty straightforward. You can do it without too much time and resource constraints, and then you'll have a very good roadmap of how you can continue to enhance your program over some period of time.
Stephen, I wanted to move to the next slide and ask you just to briefly describe these, but really explain how you can drill down to literally an issue as discrete as vendor overbilling by engaging in continuous monitoring.
Yeah, so, what you can do, and this is a little bit back to kind of how do you use compliance data and how can you figure out what data do you have to then address kind of risks that you might have. So, vendor overbilling here, and this would be a dashboard to be able to show you, what does it look like? What are the fees per month, and what are the hours, that are involved, and, what's being paid out, and who's receiving that, and where are the fees going, and be able to really then track, or do you have a vendor problem, right? Is there theft or fraud, or is there overbilling, or, do you have contract terms that would allow for these kind of payments, and what's happened in the system? And so you can use, really continuous data, and this is just an example. You can use it from, Hotline, which you can see another one here that comes from another one of Skillsoft's partners, Conversant, where, you really talk about what are external factors, what's the reporting. You can see a map of where cases are by country and by location and by topic. And so all of a sudden you can start to see, are there trends, or are there real problems, or do we see a gap? And, have we had a series of vendors that, seem to be investigated or potentially overbilling, and where do we see that problem, and, what types of vendors are involved? And then all of a sudden you can really show the return on investment to the business on, why are you saving money, and, how do you save money, and how do you protect the organization at a better level? So I know we, as we go through here, we're happy to answer questions. So if people have questions, feel free to send them in the Q&A, and we'll answer them in real time. But this is going to be, this is where you can really change your compliance program by using some of this continuous monitoring. And we help clients, set up kind of bespoke and customized dashboards that give you reporting access information that you can use internally to your company.
Stephen, on the next slide, it lists many of the services that both Skillsoft and StoneTurn provide But I was wondering if you could talk about them, not as really the services that each organization provides, but how they literally fit together in this entire different approach that we've been talking about that the Department of Justice suggested. So a risk assessment to a code of conduct, to a compliance program review, to benchmarking, to continuous monitoring, and maybe see if you could sort of tie all that together for us.
Sure. Kind of back to that 6 elements, everything based on your compliance programs, Tom, is on your risk assessment, right? And understanding the risks so that you can, look at it from a government perspective, from an industry perspective, what are best practices, what are specific risks, to your company. And then you build your compliance program, to address those risks. And the best way to do that is to then, once you've identified the risk, is to be able to really benchmark your compliance program and look to see where potential gaps are so that you continue to enhance it, like we've talked about. But then what you really want to do is you want to use your code of conduct, to be the driver of, your compliance program, really the crown jewel. This should be the number one thing that, that the company uses to engage its employees and its audience. And the way you do that is, is to have a really effective, well-written, not legalistic, not kind of the no police type of code of conduct, but something that is engaging, that people can relate with and hopefully interact with, meaning that they will be able to use it on an ongoing basis to understand what the expectations are, both from the law and from corporate policies and procedures. And if you do it right, you can really be dynamic with it in terms of ethics and values and what the expectations are, what the key risks are, and how you address those and who you raise these issues with. And the key to that is having training. And so, what we're doing is working with Skillsoft now to, take a look at, companies' code of conduct, either benchmarking it or evaluating it and providing that feedback to companies, or working with companies to enhance their code of conduct to really make it, the code 2.0, something that is much more enhanced and user-friendly and engaging to the audience, and then building from that new code of conduct, a customized training program through Skillsoft that you can then really launch to the audience and have a much more interactive involvement on an ongoing basis. It's a way to, really change your compliance program. It's a way to do something dynamic and do it really from an interesting standpoint, but also have very direct impact from a positive way about how you're voicing on the company and what you're talking about and what the keys are that employees expect. Employees, for the most part, want to do the right thing, and they just want guidance. And, the code and the code training is really the number one way you can get those messages across, and then it's ongoing communication.
We are about at 10 minutes left in our presentation, so we're going to move over to some questions that have come in. And Charlie, I think this first one is probably for you. In your remarks, you talked about the evolving nature of code of conduct training. When I started, you had a code of conduct that was absolutely sacrosanct. It was looked at maybe every 5 years, but really probably every 10 years. Is your experience and that of Skillsoft now that, particularly in the age of coronavirus, you need to have the ability to evolve your code of conduct to new and different risks on a much more nimble and agile basis?
I would say absolutely yes, Tom. Thinking of it as a sort of a living document is probably the way to put it. Obviously there are some fundamentals within the code of conduct that aren't going to change in terms of, the company's commitment to operating ethically and those sorts of concerns. But a lot of what can change and should change, as the company evolves and as the market might change, or even the operating environment, such as the case with COVID, is really the execution of those principles. And so that's where the ability to take the code of conduct document and to be able to change it as you need to in ways that help to recenter and reinforce the fundamental principles, is really key. And I think it plays into really everything we're talking about here in terms of, what the overall program needs to do and what it needs to look like. We're not suggesting that, that the company is at any point going to change its perspective on the importance of operating ethically. But as things are changing, in the world, it may look different as to how the company goes about achieving that. And so if the code document, if code of conduct itself is looked at as as a tool to achieve that and not really an end in and of itself, then I think it's a much more powerful resource that the organization as a whole can have at its disposal really to achieve those objectives.
Stephen, I think this next question is probably best suited directed to you, and it's really a practical question. How do you suggest in the age of COVID-19 with restrictions on travel or even contact that a compliance practitioner think through and execute a risk assessment?
Well, so, it's an interesting one because we hear this a lot on investigations too. How do you conduct internal investigations if you can't be on site and face-to-face with people? And it is a real challenge. The nice part on the risk assessment versus the investigation is on the risk assessment, you're not necessarily trying to find wrongdoing or problems, but I will tell you those certainly come up during risk assessment interviews, and you'd be amazed at what people will tell you that are happening in companies just based on it. But generally, it's a much more kind of friendly. You're just trying to find information. You're engaging the interviewee, in a series of questions and dialogue more than you would the same in investigation. And so what you can do that remotely. You can do it by Zoom. And while we're all tired of Zoom and video types of conferences, it does give you the ability to be very effective, meaning you're not having to travel to various countries, and you can cover a lot more in terms of interviews by doing it remotely. Look, there are some very good upsides about being live on the ground, and I will tell you, I've worked in risk assessments and compliance program types of reviews, investigations in probably 50 different countries, and it is hard to replicate being on site in person and working with those teams, but the reality is that's what you have to do. And so I try to do it as engaging as possible, really try to get people and draw them out on Zoom and in video and talking to them and explaining why this is important. And so you'd be surprised how many people are going to be willing to really still share that information. But then it's looking at documents and controls, and you can do control testing and you can do transaction testing, all those kinds of things remotely. So, all that part of the risk assessment, if a company chooses to include that, can certainly be done remotely.
Charlie, this next question I think might properly be directed towards you, and it's a question about what is a cadence for the administration of compliance training, of your compliance training program. Should it be an annual, or would you suggest perhaps a different way to think through it?
Yeah, that's a great question and probably a very complicated answer. On one end of the spectrum, obviously for certain issues, and we'll just take harassment as a great example, certain jurisdictions, they specify a training mandate as well as a cadence for providing that training. And so that's an easy one. We can just follow, what the state requires, for example. But if we're talking about, code of conduct training, where there is no specific mandate in terms of the interval for training and that sort of thing, then it's very much up to the organization. And I think it's part of the analysis within the risk assessment, because you can look at it from the perspective of, well, how much is changing, from one risk assessment effort to another. Maybe the answer is there isn't necessarily, a one-size-fits-all cadence, even within one organization. It may come down to, what does the risk assessment reveal? If the risk assessment happens and, basically nothing new is uncovered, there aren't any hot spots that are the result of that assessment, everything is relatively status quo, if that's even possible, then maybe there isn't a need to emphasize retraining on sort of the same issues that we covered in the last code of conduct. I suspect that's relatively infrequent. I think that, more likely if you're conducting a risk assessment and doing it well, you're necessarily going to uncover something that, that warrants some kind of emphasis or some kind of follow-up. But the nice thing about that is it can help to inform the cadence of the training, because it can help you to identify, those areas that you need to address now that may not have been addressed in the last code of conduct training. So that provides you with guidance on what you want to emphasize the next time through.
It looks like that is all the questions that have come in from our audience. So we're about at 5 minutes before the hour. I'm going to pitch it back to you, Betsy.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom, Charlie, Stephen, for sharing your views today. It was a great presentation. Thanks to everyone in the audience who joined our webinar, Evolving Your Compliance Program. A couple follow-up items here. We will be emailing all webinar registrants a recording of the webinar we had today, as well as the slides. You can expect that in your email inbox in the coming days. We hope you found the session engaging. If you'd like to learn more about Skillsoft or StoneTurn, please check out our website. You can check out skillsoft.com/StoneTurn or stoneturn.com to learn more about both of our organizations. And on behalf of Skillsoft and StoneTurn, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and I hope you can join future conversations with us. Thanks.